The rope creaked twice before K.L. Ardeen understood what he was hearing, and by the third creak his rifle was already up. 6 years alone on Thessaly 4 had taught him to trust sound before sight. The crawlers here moved without a whisper, so nothing silent should have made Rope groan against frozen bark. He stepped through the frost-needle trees, with his breath fogging in ragged pulls, his pulse settling into the slow, deliberate rhythm it always found right before violence. What waited for him instead of a threat stopped that rhythm cold. She hung from the lowest branch of a black-limbed tree, her toes inches above the frost, her silver-gray skin gone the color of old ash. Not human, elongated fingers, a second joint at the elbow, a throat ringed with rope burn beneath a collar etched with fine markings that might have been decoration, or might have been a name in a language he would never hear spoken aloud. Her eyes were closed, her chest did not move. He should have turned around. 6 years of survival had taught him that mysteries on Thessaly 4 always came with teeth. Instead, he found his knife already open, the rope already parting, her weight already dropping into his arms, lighter than he expected, hollow-boned, bird-like, and he was lowering her into the snow before he'd decided to do any of it. No pulse, he recognized. But when he pressed 2 fingers beneath her jaw, he felt something, a slow, wrong rhythm, nothing like a human heartbeat, but a rhythm all the same. Her skin was cold enough to burn, and beneath his fingers he could feel it fighting to hold on to whatever warmth was left, the way a dying ember still throws heat if you're close enough to notice. She was alive, which meant someone or something had hanged her and left her to die in a forest 400 kilometers from the nearest known settlement, on a planet Kale had believed until this exact second held no one but him. He looked up at the empty trees, at the rope still swinging on its branch like it hadn't finished its job, and understood with the flat certainty of a man who trusted his gut because it was the only thing left that hadn't lied to him. Whoever did this might still be watching. 6 years had taught KL the particular silence of a dead colony, the way wind moved through empty structures like it was hunting for someone to blame. He had buried 11 people with his own hands, marked each grave with whatever scrap metal he could spare, and told himself every day since that being the last one standing was its own quiet sentence. He'd stopped expecting anything new. He'd stopped, if he was honest with himself, expecting anything at all. Now there was a girl who wasn't human, warmth bleeding slowly back into her fingers on his dead crewmate's cot. And somewhere behind his ribs, something he hadn't let himself feel in years was stirring awake. The terrible, dangerous shape of hope. He almost hated it, the way it made his chest ache in a place that had gone numb out of necessity. The way it reminded him he'd once been a man who cared what happened to people other than himself. 600 light-years away, Sarah Von Tal was drowning in a fire she couldn't see. The relay station's reactor core had been bleeding radiation for 11 minutes, and the emergency klaxon had stopped sounding like noise and started feeling like a fist, pressing behind her eyes. Heat radiated up through the deck plating in waves she could feel through her boots, and somewhere below her, the reactor's containment field was singing a high, thin note that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking on the failing console. Not fear, she told herself, a lie she'd stopped believing 3 minutes ago. Her name meant nothing here anymore. Her rank meant even less. The tribunal had stripped both the instant she falsified an execution order, and now the only thing that mattered was the countdown bleeding red across her cracked visor. 17 minutes until the core breached and Vestra Relay collapsed into a small, violent star. She should have been sprinting for the escape pods. Instead, she was routing the station's last power reserves into a single narrow-beam transmission, aimed at a planet she'd sworn, under oath, on record, she would never speak of again. A voice cut through her comm, static warped and furious. You had one task, Von Tal. One, and you couldn't even hang her properly. Sarah didn't answer. Her fingers found the bracelet at her wrist, twin to the one she'd fastened around a girl's throat 6 years ago, disguised as a collar, its real purpose known to no one alive but the two of them. She's alive, Sarah said finally, quiet, almost a vow, to no one who would ever forgive her for it, and she's staying that way. The reactor screamed, the countdown dropped to 16, and buried inside the 17 seconds of garbled static she'd just sent across 600 light-years was a single coordinate, and a single word, run. Sarah had served the tribunal 11 years before the night they ordered her to hang a 14-year-old girl for the crime of existing. She remembered every second of it with the precision of a wound that never fully closed. The way Mira hadn't screamed, hadn't fought, had only looked at her with those entirely black eyes and asked, quietly, if it would hurt. Sarah had lied and said no. Then she'd rigged the rope to fail and the collar to read as death, and spent 6 years waiting for that lie to catch up with her. It had taken exactly one falsified order. One reactor left to bleed instead of scrammed on schedule. One message she should never have sent. She didn't regret it. That was the strange, cold thing she noticed, as the pod's thrusters fired and the dying station fell away behind her. She'd spent 6 years dreading this exact moment, and now that it had finally arrived, all she felt was relief. Cale carried the girl back to the bunker he'd built from a crashed supply module, rifle slung, moving fast, checking behind him every dozen steps at trees that offered 1,000 places to hide something patient. Snow squeaked under his boots louder than he wanted it to, and every breath came out in a plume that seemed to hang in the air far longer than it should. 6 years alone had made him fluent in a forest silence. Tonight the silence was wrong, too complete, like something nearby was holding its breath alongside him. Inside, he laid her on the cot that had belonged to his dead crewmate, wrapped her in the last intact thermal blanket, and did the only thing he still knew how to do: watch and wait, and hope she wouldn't die on him the way everyone else on this rock eventually had. Her eyes opened 4 hours later, entirely black, no white at all, and they fixed on him with an intelligence sharp enough to lift the hair on his arms. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She only touched the rope burn at her own throat, looked at him and asked, in accented but flawless standard, "How long was I hanging?" "I don't know," Cale admitted. "Found you an hour before dawn." "You weren't breathing, right?" "But you were breathing." "That's the mercy," she said, and something in her voice cracked despite how steady she kept it. "It's supposed to look complete. If it looks complete, they stop watching. Cale filed the word away like a splinter he'd have to dig out later. "Who did this to you?" She studied him a long moment, his 6-year beard, the scars mapping his knuckles, the particular exhaustion worn by a man who'd buried an entire colony alone. "You're out here by yourself," she said. Not a question. Truly alone. 6 years. "Then you don't know what's coming," she said, sitting up too fast, swaying one hand gripping the cot frame white-knuckled. "My name is Mira, and before this day ends, this planet is going to have visitors who'll kill you, just for having seen my face." Cale thought of the 11 graves outside his bunker, each one a person who'd trusted this planet to hold nothing worse than weather and hunger. He thought of 6 years of silence, and how fast it had turned out to be a lie he'd told himself, because the alternative, that something out there had simply been waiting, patient and unhurried, for a reason to finally notice him, was worse than any grief he already carried. "You could leave," Mira said, watching him with those unreadable black eyes, "right now. Take whatever you can carry and get as far from me as this planet allows. I wouldn't blame you." Cale looked at the rope burn circling her throat, at the collar of markings that might have been her mother's handwriting, at a girl who'd been 14 years old when someone first decided her life was worth less than a secret. 6 years alone had taught him exactly what it cost to abandon someone to save yourself. He'd done it once already, the day the last supply ship left without him, and he chose to stay, rather than report a colony he suspected wouldn't survive inspection. He wasn't interested in doing it twice. "I found you," he said simply. "That makes you my problem now." Outside, faint but unmistakable, something crossed the sky, and it did not sound like weather. Sarah made it to the escape pod with 4 minutes on the clock, which should have felt like victory and instead felt like nothing at all, because the voice on her comm hadn't stopped talking. "You think a coordinate saves her?" Commander Yorek's voice was pure ice through the static. "You think 6 years hiding her on some frozen rock changes what she is, what she did?" "She was 14, Sarah snapped, sealing the pod hatch, her hands finally steady, colder now than shaking had ever been. 14 years old, and you wanted her hanged for a crime her mother committed. The choosing doesn't care about age, it cares about bloodline. Mira Solan's bloodline carries the encryption key to the Ashari Warfleet's Dead Man protocols, and as long as she's breathing, every faction in this war has a reason to cut her open and take it." The pod launched. G-force slammed Sarah into her seat as Vestra Relay shrank behind her, still 11 minutes from its final silent flash of light. I gave her 6 years she wasn't supposed to have, Sarah said, mostly to herself now. I'm not letting the tribunal take them back. Ahead of her, a tribunal cutter, sleek, black, unmarked, dropped out of slip space directly into her flight path, close enough that its running lights flooded her cockpit red. The proximity alarm screamed in a register that matched, almost mockingly, the reactor's dying warning 600 light-years behind her. They'd found the transmission. They'd found the coordinate. The cutter didn't fire, not yet. It matched her pod's trajectory instead, close enough that Sarah could see the shapes of a boarding crew moving behind its viewport, patient in the way only people certain of their own victory could afford to be. They wanted her alive long enough to finish the job for them, she realized. They wanted her to do exactly what she was already doing, fly straight to the girl and confirm, beyond doubt, that the coordinate in her message had been real. She thought about pulling up, breaking off, scattering herself across some empty space rather than hand the tribunal what they wanted on a silver plate. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to remember Mira's voice asking if it would hurt, 6 years ago, in a room with no windows. Would you have sent that message, knowing exactly what it would cost you? Fleet deadman protocols, Kale repeated, watching the girl who called herself Mira pull a spare coat over her thermal blanket, her hands still trembling from cold or fear or both. You're telling me you're carrying some kind of key. In your blood? In the marrow. In the encryption lattice woven through my genetic code before I was born. My mother was a fleet cryptographer for the Ashari High Command. When she defected, she made sure her defection couldn't be undone. She built the override straight into her own unborn daughter. I've spent 6 years hoping I'd die of something ordinary before anyone remembered I exist. Kale thought of the crashed module outside, of the 11 colonists he'd buried in 6 years, of the particular loneliness of being the last living thing for 400 kilometers in any direction, and how none of it, it turned out, had actually made him safe. It had only made him quiet. Who hanged you, Sarah? The name came out soft, almost tender, entirely at odds with the rope burn still visible on her throat. My handler, She stopped, swallowed hard. She was supposed to execute me 11 days ago. Instead, she faked it. Made it look complete enough that the tribunal would stop watching this system. Then smuggled me here and vanished so they couldn't trace it back to her. And now? Mira's black eyes drifted to the bunker's single reinforced window, to the sky beyond it, gone the wrong color at the edges, a bruised, encroaching violet Kale had never once seen in 6 years on this rock. Now the message she sent to warn me probably told them exactly where I am too. The bunker's proximity alarm went off a heartbeat later. One flat tone Kale had installed, tested and prayed for 6 straight years he'd never actually hear. He killed the lights on reflex and dragged Mira down behind the module's reinforced hull plating, rifle up, eyes locked on the door. 3 shapes dropped through the violet sky on burn trails that sliced the dark like open wounds. The heat of their descent hit the tree line seconds before they landed, melting a ring of snow into black mud around each point of impact. Not a rescue, a hunting party. Whatever's out there, Mira breathed, doesn't knock. Kale had run combat drills exactly twice in his life, both during colony orientation, both taught by an instructor who died in the same accident that claimed 9 of the 11 people he'd since buried. He'd never expected to need them again. Now his hands moved through the old muscle memory almost without him, checking the rifle's charge, counting rounds, angling Mira behind the thickest section of hull plating with a steadiness that surprised even him. You've done this before, Mira said quietly. Not quite a question. Not this, Kale said. Just people, just this planet, trying to kill me in smaller ways for 6 years. He racked the charging handle. Guess it was practice. Kale fired twice before the first hunter reached the tree line, and both shots did nothing. The armor plating across its chest swallowed the impact like the rounds were snowflakes. Not human either, he realized in the strobing muzzle flash dark, but nothing like Mira. Its face was a mask, expressionless, built for exactly one purpose. Get down, Mira shouted, and for the first time he heard something other than fear in her voice, command. Aim for the joints, the neck seam. They're not armored everywhere. He adjusted, fired again, and this time the hunter staggered, a thin line of dark fluid spraying across the snow. 2 more were already closing from the flank. This is what you meant, Kale said, breath ragged, reloading with hands gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. when you said visitors. The choosing doesn't send diplomats, Mira said. It sends collectors, and you're standing between them and the only thing they've ever wanted from me. Overhead, a new light tore through the violet sky, faster than the others, trailing fire, and for one terrible second Cale was certain it was a fourth hunter arriving to finish what the first three had started. Then it slammed into the ground 300 meters out. Not a landing, a controlled crash, and a figure staggered from the wreckage into the storm. Sarah came up out of the ruined escape pod with a sidearm in one hand and blood running warm down the side of her face, and the first thing she saw across the burning snow was the girl she'd hanged with her own hands 6 years ago, alive, upright, staring back at her with an expression that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite anything else Sarah had a word for. There was no time for either of them to say what 6 years of separation demanded. The nearest hunter turned from Cale toward the new arrival, recalculating threat priority, and Sarah put 2 rounds into its neck seam before it finished turning. "You found her," Sarah said to Cale. Not a question, already moving, already reloading, the old competence flooding back into her hands like it had never left. "You should have run." "I didn't know what I was running from," Cale said. "Still don't, Mira," Sarah said, and the girl's name in her mouth carried 6 years of everything left unsaid. "I'm sorry it took this long." "You faked my death and disappeared," Mira said, her voice shaking now. "Finally, after everything. You don't get to apologize in the middle of a firefight." "Then let's survive it first," Sarah said, low and steady, and turned to drop a third hunter before it reached the tree line. The last hunter didn't charge. It stood at the edge of the burning wreckage, mask unmoving, and spoke in a voice that was not quite mechanical and not quite alive, relaying the words that belonged to someone else entirely, someone watching from very far away. "Commander Yorick regrets that this location will not survive collection," the hunter said. "The tribunal cutter is already inbound with orbital strike authorization. Sarah Von Tal, Mira Selen, and one unidentified colonist, full sterilization. Compliance was never actually the objective." Cale understood, in the half-second before the hunter's mask flared with a final targeting glow, that Yorick had never meant to recover Mira alive. The choosing didn't want the key returned. It wanted the key destroyed and every witness alongside it, cleanly, deniably from orbit, with no wreckage left behind to raise questions and no survivors left to answer them. Sarah fired first. The hunter dropped, but high above the violet sky a new light was already blooming. Steady, patient, far too bright to be another hunter. "That's the strike ship," Sarah said quietly. "We have maybe 6 minutes." "6 minutes to do what?" Cale asked, and found that his voice, for the first time in 6 years, wasn't entirely steady either. Mira answered before Sarah could. "To decide what my mother's key is actually for," she said, "because I don't think it's a weapon. I think it's an off switch. And I think Yorick would rather burn this whole planet than let anyone find out he's wrong." A console lay half-buried in the wreckage of Sarah's pod, scorched but not dead, and Mira moved toward it with a certainty that told Cale this had never really been about hiding. It had been about waiting for the one moment when running out of places to run turned into something else entirely. She pressed her palm to a panel with no obvious reason to answer her, and it lit anyway. Faint blue light climbing up through her fingers, the markings on her collar and the markings buried in the console's dead technology matching in a way that lifted the hair on Cale's arms again. Differently this time. "The dead man protocol isn't a bomb," Mira said, her voice steady even as the orbital light overhead grew brighter, closer, unmistakably a weapon arming. "It's a broadcast. My mother built it so that if the Ashri fleet ever turned its dead man switch on innocent people, the truth of every order, every atrocity, every falsified transmission would go out across the whole sector at once. Yorick's been terrified of this exact moment for 6 years, not because I'm dangerous, because I'm honest." "Then finish it," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that Cale, stranger to all of this as he was, recognized instantly. 6 years of guilt finally finding somewhere to go. Mira's black eyes closed. Light climbed the console, up her arm, across her collar, along her throat, tracing the rope burn like it was reading a scar instead of the thing that had caused. For one heartbeat, Cale was certain he was watching her die a second time. Then the light released, outward, up through the violet sky, past the arming weapon, past the cutter, out into the dark between stars where 6 years of silence had been waiting to finally become noise. The orbital strike ship's weapon didn't fire. Its light guttered, flickered, and instead of death, it sent down a different transmission entirely. One that reached every relay, every command channel, every screen across the war it had helped wage, carrying Sarah's falsified orders and Yorick's true ones side by side, undeniable, unforgivable, complete. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Cale had heard in 6 years. Not the silence of a dead colony this time, not the silence of 11 graves and a radio that never called back. A different silence entirely, the kind that settles after something true finally gets said out loud, and the universe for one long moment simply has to sit with it. Above them, the strike ship's weapon powered down completely, its crew presumably staring at screens full of orders they could no longer pretend not to have seen. Somewhere across the sector, in rooms Cale would never visit, to people he would never meet, careers were ending and questions were finally being asked out loud. He understood, watching Sarah hold a girl she'd once been ordered to kill, that this was what 6 years of hiding had actually been building toward, not survival for its own sake, but survival long enough for the truth to finally have somewhere to land. Mira sank to her knees in the snow, exhausted but breathing, and Sarah was there before she hit the ground, catching her the way she should have, Cale thought, 6 years ago, before any of this became necessary. "It's done," Mira whispered. "They can't unhear it. They can't pretend they didn't know." Sarah held her without answering, because there was nothing left to defend and nothing left to hide. And for the first time since Cale had cut a rope down in a frozen forest, the sky above Thessaly 4 held nothing more dangerous than stars. The wreckage around them still smoked faint orange embers dying against the snow, but the violet had already begun bleeding out of the sky, leaving behind the ordinary black he remembered from 6 quiet years before any of this began. Here is what 6 years alone had never taught Cale Arden, and what one night nearly killed him teaching instead. Mercy, the real kind, is rarely clean, and it almost never arrives without a cost attached. Sarah Von Tull spent 6 years carrying the weight of a girl she couldn't save cleanly, only enough to keep her alive, and that imperfect, desperate kindness was the only reason any of them lived to hear the truth spoken aloud. Somewhere out there right now, someone is deciding whether the safe thing or the right thing matters more. If this story made you feel that choice sit in your chest, hit subscribe, because Xeno Fantasy exists for exactly these moments, and there are more of them waiting.